The battlefield is quiet when the first white infantryman steps forward from E2 to E4, driving into the center like a spear planted in contested ground. This advance claims space, opens lines for the queen and king's bishop, and declares that the light army will fight for the initiative from move 1. Black answers symmetrically, sending the pawn from E7 to E5 to meet it. The structure is balanced, but by copying, the dark army accepts a reactive role. The side with the first move now has the burden and privilege of attack. White's cavalry moves next. The knight on G1 leaps to F3, a horseman taking up a central post, pressuring the pawn on E5 and guarding the king at the same time. This is clean development with a direct hit on Black's center. Black replies not with a piece, but with a supporting infantry move. The pawn marches from D7 to D6, reinforcing the pawn on E5. It is solid and modest, but it locks in the bishop on C8 and hints at a somewhat cramped defensive stance. The white commander refuses to let the center settle. A second pawn advances from D2 to Di4, striking directly at the pawn on E5 and challenging Black's foothold in the middle. This is principled warfare. More space, more tension, more open lines for active pieces. Instead of resolving that central clash immediately, Black sends the dark-squared bishop from C8 all the way out to G4, pinning the knight on F3 to the queen on D1. The move is active and provocative, but from a grandmaster's view, it is slightly indulgent. It hunts a pin instead of addressing the crumbling central structure and prepares, perhaps, to give up that bishop for a knight in an already opening battlefield. White seizes the moment. The pawn on D4 steps forward to E5 and captures the pawn from E5, exploding the central contact. This thrust opens lines toward the Dark King and forces Black to confront an advanced enemy pawn in the very heart of the board. Black responds with a sharp decision. The bishop on G4 abandons the pin and dives to F3, cutting down the knight on F3. This exchange trades a bishop for a knight and removes one attacker, but it also surrenders the bishop pair in a position that is already becoming open and tactical. The queen, until now a quiet monarch in the back rank, joins the fray. She glides from D1 to F3 and recaptures the bishop on F3, placing heavy artillery in the center with tempo. The white forces now have a queen and an advanced pawn pointing at the enemy king with multiple lines poised to open. Black's pawn from Di6 steps forward to E5 and recaptures the pawn that had invaded from D4 to E5. Material is level again, but the strategic picture is not. Black's pawn wall is compact, yet the pieces lag behind in development, and the king remains in the crosshairs of the central files. White now brings the king's bishop into action with purpose. The bishop on F1 crosses the diagonal to C4, taking aim at the sensitive square in front of Black's king on F7 and harmonizing perfectly with the queen on F3. This development is not just natural, it carries immediate latent pressure on the king's position. In reply, Black's king's knight finally emerges from G8 to F6. The knight eyes the pawn on A4 and helps control key central squares, but it also becomes a target. With the bishop on C4 and the queen nearby, any piece that comes into the open must be ready for scrutiny. The white queen now shifts her point of attack. She leaves F3, gliding along the third rank to B3, where she simultaneously eyes the pawn on B7 and renews pressure on F7, in concert with the bishop on C4. This move from F3 to B3 increases the strain on both flanks and embodies the initiative. White threatens in multiple directions while still keeping the king safe. Black responds by moving the queen from D8 to E7, stepping in front of the bishop on f8 and hurrying to guard both b7 and f7. It is a necessary consolidation, but from an expert's perspective, it is awkward. The most powerful black piece is forced into a defensive crouch, blocking its own bishop and failing to address the unresolved question of king safety. White continues to mobilize with methodical aggression. The queenside knight rides out from b1 to c3, adding another attacker to the center and increasing the pressure on d5, e4, and b5. White's army now has both knights, one bishop, and the queen actively coordinated around the black king. Black tries to bolster the structure by advancing the pawn from c7 to c6. This move helps restrain the white pieces by controlling d5 and prepares potential counterplay with a later push in the center or queenside. However, in this concrete position, it is slow. It spends a tempo on a pawn while the king is still inert and the queenside pieces remain dormant. The second white bishop now joins the attack. From its starting square on c1, it sweeps along the diagonal to g5, staring at the knight on f6 and indirectly at the queen on a7 behind it. This pin ties the knight to the queen and further restricts black's ability to untangle. Positionally, this is a powerful move. Every white piece is now aimed at the central complex, where the black king still lurks. Under pressure, black lunges on the flank, pushing the pawn from b7 to b5 to hit the bishop on c4 and gain space on the queenside. In a safer position, this advance might be a healthy expansion, but here it is strategically risky, loosening the very wing where the king might later seek refuge and creating tactical targets on the dark squares. White immediately turns that overextension into a weapon. The knight on c3 jumps forward to b5 and captures the pawn that just advanced from b7 to b5. The cavalry has leapt deep into enemy territory, trading itself for structural damage and open lines near the king. This sacrifice is not romantic speculation. It is calculated exploitation. With black underdeveloped and the queenside cracking, the cost of a single knight is a fair price for an attack. Forced to react, black uses the pawn from c6 to capture that knight, moving from c6 to b5 and removing the intruder. The queenside pawn structure is now shredded, and the diagonal to the black king is opening like a breached wall. The white bishop that had come out from f1 earlier closes in for the kill. From c4, it advances to b5, capturing the pawn that has just arrived from c6 to b5 and delivering check to the king along the diagonal. That bishop strike from c4 to b5 not only removes a vital defender, but also uncovers the full force of white's pieces against the central monarch. Black is compelled to interpose. The queenside knight finally emerges from b8 to d7, stepping into the line of fire to block the check. This develops a piece and holds the position together for the moment, but the knight arrives late, walking into a sector of the board already dominated by enemy forces. White now decides where to shelter the king and chooses aggression over caution. The king leaves e1 and performs a long castling maneuver, traveling to c1, while the rook on a1 swings across the back rank to d1. This single operation from e1 to c1 and a 1 to d1 is strategically perfect. The king reaches safety behind queenside pawns, and the rook instantly occupies the open d-file facing the black queen and king. Black tries to contest that vital corridor by sliding the rook from a8 to d8, meeting rook with rook and hoping for exchanges to ease the pressure. In principle, fighting for the only open file is correct, but in practice, black's forces are too cramped and poorly coordinated for equality. The white rook on d1 wastes no time. It rushes forward along the file from e1 to d7 and captures the knight that had thrown itself to d7 in defense. This rook invasion onto the 7th rank is a brutal penetration. A key defender disappears, and the rook plants itself in the heart of black's position, attacking pawns and pieces and threatening the king's shelter. The price is that the rook is now exposed, but in this position, activity is worth more than material. Black is forced to respond by moving the rook from d8 to di7, recapturing on that square and eliminating the invading tower. One pair of rooks disappears, but the exchange does not cure the underlying sickness of the black camp. The king is still in the center, and the queen side has been largely dismantled. White calmly replaces lost pressure with new force. The rook that had been slumbering in the corner on h1 glides across the first rank to d1, once again taking control of the open d file. This move from h1 to d1 looks quiet, but it is a model of precision. White restores dominance over the only critical file and lines up the rook directly opposite the black king on e8. Black's queen, still burdened with defensive tasks, leaves a 7 and moves to a 6, trying to improve her position. From e6, she protects the rook on d7, covers some dark squares around the king, and eyes potential counterplay on the queen side. Yet, strategically, this is still damage control. The queen is overworked, and the king's position remains dangerously constricted. White's light-squared bishop, which has already carved its way into the queen side, now delivers a decisive blow. From b5, it marches to d7 and captures the rook on d7, once again checking the king on a8. This bishop sacrifice from b5 to d7 strips black of its last major defender on the d file and rips open the final layer of the king's armor. Materially, white gives up a bishop, but the resulting attack is overwhelming. Black has little choice. The knight on f6 is summoned back to the front and jumps from f6 to d7, recapturing the bishop on d7 and blocking the check. The knight now stands as the last serious bodyguard between the white heavy pieces and the monarch, but it is overloaded and sitting on an unstable outpost. White's queen now launches the final deep strike. From her post on b3, she rises straight up the file to b8, giving check to the king on e8 along the 8th rank. This move from b3 to b8 is a cold tactical dagger. It threatens immediate devastation if ignored, and exploits the weakened back rank and the knight's precarious position. Black cannot sidestep the threat and is forced to accept the bait. The knight on d7 retreats to b8 and captures the queen on b8, seemingly scoring a major defensive success by removing white's most powerful piece. But this gain is illusory. By capturing on b8, the knight abandons its post, blocking the d file, and leaves the back rank fatally exposed to the remaining white forces. The final stroke is simple and merciless. The rook on d1 advances straight up the file to d8, landing beside the black king on e8 and delivering check. From d8, the rook slices horizontally across the back rank, attacking the king on e8 directly. The monarch cannot capture the rook because the surviving white bishop on g5 still commands the diagonal from g5 through f6 and e7 to de8, turning the de8 square into a poisoned fortress. No black piece can interpose between king and rook. There is no square on the 8th rank between them, and no unit can appear out of thin air. There is no flight square either. The rook on d8 controls d7 and the entire d file, the bishop on g5 covers e7, and the shattered pawn cover provides no shelter. The queen and bishop can only watch as the king stands in the open, his army torn apart by earlier overextension and neglected development. With the rook anchored on d8 and every escape sealed by calm, precise coordination, the Dark King falls to a final logical execution of the attack. Checkmate has arrived exactly as the position demanded, not as a miracle, but as the inevitable conclusion of a lost battle for time, space, and structure.